March 26, 1943, 08:30 hours. The Bering Sea. The water was the color of iron, grey and cold, moving in long, heavy swells that rocked the ships like toys in a bathtub. Fog hung low over the waves, thick enough to taste, drifting in patches that appeared and vanished without warning. The temperature hovered just above freezing, cold enough that the spray coming over the bows turned to ice on contact with steel, coating railings and gun turrets in a crystalline shell that grew thicker with each passing hour. In the distance, perhaps 20 miles to the south, the Komandorski Islands rose from the sea, bare rock and tundra, uninhabited, worthless, except as navigation markers in an ocean where everything looked the same. On the bridge of the USS Richmond, Rear Admiral Charles "Sock" McMorris stood with his binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the horizon. He had been at sea for 36 hours, patrolling the shipping lanes between the Aleutian Islands and the Russian Kamchatka Peninsula, searching for the Japanese convoy that intelligence said would be coming. His task force was small: one heavy cruiser, the Salt Lake City, one light cruiser, the Richmond, and 4 destroyers. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and operating at the edge of the world, where help was 500 miles away and the weather could kill you as surely as enemy shells. At 08:40, a lookout's voice cut through the bridge chatter. Ships bearing 040, range approximately 12 miles. McMorris swung his binoculars north. Through the fog, he could see them. Dark shapes on the horizon, silhouettes that grew sharper as the range closed. 2 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, at least 4 destroyers, a convoy of transports, and then, emerging from behind the screening ships like a mountain rising from the sea, something larger, the Nachi, a Japanese heavy cruiser, 10,000 tons, armed with 10 8-inch guns in 5 twin turrets. And behind her the Maya, identical in every respect. Together, they mounted 28-inch guns, enough firepower to sink McMorris's entire task force if they landed enough hits. McMorris lowered his binoculars. He did not need to consult charts or intelligence reports. He understood immediately what he was facing: a fight he could not win, in waters he could not escape, with ships he could not afford to lose. The smart decision would be to turn away, retreat into the fog, and hope the Japanese didn't follow. The smart decision would be to preserve his force and live to fight another day. But McMorris did not turn away, because behind those Japanese warships were transports, supply ships carrying food, ammunition, reinforcements to the Japanese garrisons in the Aleutians. If those supplies reached their destination, American soldiers fighting on Attu and Kiska would face a stronger, better-fed enemy. The mission was not to survive. The mission was to stop the convoy. McMorris gave the order: all ships prepare for battle. Come to course 040. Increase speed to 25 knots. The last pure-gun duel between surface fleets in naval history was about to begin. This is the story of the Battle of the Komandorski Islands, a fight that should never have happened, between ships that could barely see each other, in waters so cold that men who fell overboard would die in minutes. It is the story of a 4-hour running gun battle where no torpedoes were used, no aircraft participated, no submarines lurked, just ships, guns, and the mathematics of ballistics played out on a grey sea at the edge of the world. It is the story of how a smaller American force, outgunned and outnumbered, fought a superior Japanese fleet to a standstill through gunnery, seamanship, and sheer stubborn refusal to retreat. And it is the story of how the age of the battleship, the era when war was decided by steel hulls and rifled barrels, came to an end not with a dramatic climax, but with a slow, grinding realization that the future belonged to aircraft, not guns. To understand March 26, 1943, you must first understand the Aleutian Islands, that 1,000-mile arc of volcanic rock stretching from Alaska toward Russia, separating the Bering Sea from the Pacific Ocean. They are among the most inhospitable places on Earth. Treeless, windswept, shrouded in fog for most of the year, lashed by storms that can sink ships and ground aircraft for weeks at a time. The native Aleut people called them the cradle of the storms. The American soldiers sent to fight there called them hell. In June 1942, as part of the diversionary operation for the Midway attack, Japanese forces had invaded and occupied two of the western Aleutian islands, Attu and Kiska. It was the first time since the War of 1812 that foreign military forces had occupied American territory. The occupation was strategically marginal. The islands had no significant resources, no population centers, no real military value. But symbolically it was intolerable. American soil was under Japanese control. By early 1943, the United States had begun planning to retake the islands. But any amphibious assault would require months of preparation, enormous logistical effort, and thousands of troops. In the meantime, the Japanese garrisons needed to be isolated, cut off from supplies and reinforcements. This meant interdicting the shipping routes between Japan and the Aleutians, a mission assigned to Admiral McMorris's small cruiser-destroyer task force, operating out of Dutch Harbour in the eastern Aleutians. It was a war of patrols and cat-and-mouse games. The Japanese would send supply convoys north, protected by warships. The Americans would try to intercept them. Most of the time, the convoys got through. The ocean was too vast, the weather too unpredictable, the intelligence too incomplete. But occasionally, through skill or luck or a combination of both, the hunters found their prey. March 26 was one of those occasions. The Japanese convoy that McMorris intercepted that morning was designated Transport Unit 1, commanded by Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya. It consisted of 3 transports carrying 2,500 troops and supplies for the Attu garrison, escorted by a powerful force, 2 heavy cruisers, Nachi and Maya, 2 light cruisers, Tama and Abukuma, 4 destroyers, and the armed merchant cruiser Asaka Maru. Hosogaya's orders were straightforward: deliver the supplies to Attu, avoid engagement with American forces if possible, and return to Paramushiro in the Kuril Islands. Hosogaya was a cautious commander, a man who understood that preserving his ships was more important than winning glory. He knew that the Imperial Japanese Navy could not afford to lose heavy cruisers in pointless battles. Every ship sunk, every sailor killed, was a loss that could not be replaced. Unlike the Americans, who could build ships faster than they could be sunk, Japan's industrial capacity was finite. The mathematics of attrition were against them. When his lookout spotted McMorris's task force at 0842, Hosogaya faced a dilemma. He had overwhelming firepower, 28-inch guns against 8. He had more ships, more speed, more options. But engaging the Americans meant delaying the supply run, exposing his transports, and risking damage to his warships in unpredictable weather. The smart move was to send the transports back to Paramushiro and use his warships to drive off the Americans. That is exactly what he did. At 0850, Hosogaya ordered the transports to reverse course and retreat northwest. Then he turned his cruisers and destroyers south, placing his force between the Americans and the convoy, and prepared to engage. It was a decision born of caution, not aggression. Hosogaya did not want a battle, but if the Americans insisted on pressing the issue, he would give them one. On the Salt Lake City, the crew watched as the Japanese warships turned toward them. The swayback Maru, as the sailors called her, a nickname born from the ship's distinctive profile, was a treaty cruiser. Built in 1929 to comply with the Washington Naval Treaty's 10,000-ton limit. She mounted 10 8-inch guns in 4 turrets, could make 32 knots at full speed, and had fought in nearly every major Pacific engagement since Pearl Harbor. She was tough, experienced, and dangerous. She was also outnumbered 2-1. Captain Bertram Rogers, commanding the Salt Lake City, understood the mathematics. His ship could fire a broadside of 10 8-inch shells every 20 seconds. The Japanese heavy cruisers, working together, could fire 20 shells in the same time. In a slugging match, the Americans would lose. Their only advantage was experience. The Salt Lake City's crew had been drilling on gunnery for months. They knew their ship, knew their guns, knew how to compensate for wind, current, and the rolling motion of the sea. At 8:52, the Japanese cruiser Nachi opened fire. The first salvo fell short, raising geysers of white water 500 yards ahead of the Salt Lake City. The second salvo was closer, straddling the American cruiser with splashes on both sides. The Japanese gunners were finding their range. At 0854, McMorris gave the order to return fire. The Salt Lake City's forward turrets swung to bearing, elevated to maximum range, and fired. The ship shuddered. 8-inch shells, each weighing 260 pounds, arced across the 18,000 yards separating the fleets. 20 seconds later, splashes appeared around the Nachi. The Americans had their range, too. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands had begun. For the next 4 hours, the two fleets would fight a running gun battle that moved slowly across 60 miles of ocean. It was a strange, almost archaic form of warfare. Ships maneuvering in long columns, firing broadsides at extreme range, using smoke screens and course changes to avoid hits. There were no dive bombers screaming down from the sky, no torpedoes slicing through the water, no submarines lurking beneath, just guns and steel, and the calculations of men trying to predict where their enemy would be 30 seconds in the future. The Japanese had the advantage in firepower and numbers, but McMorris neutralized this through tactics. He kept his ships at maximum range, around 20,000 yards, where the 8-inch guns of both sides were near their effective limit. At that distance, hitting a moving target required skill, patience, and luck. The Japanese fired salvos constantly, bracketing the American ships with splashes, but scoring few direct hits. The Americans fired less frequently, conserving ammunition, waiting for the moment when the range closed and accuracy improved. At 09:30, a Japanese shell struck the Salt Lake City, penetrating the hull near the waterline and flooding one of the engine rooms. The ship slowed, listing slightly to port. Damage control teams rushed to seal the breach, working in darkness, waist-deep in freezing water. Above them, the guns continued firing, shaking the ship with each salvo. Captain Rogers did not report the damage to Admiral McMorris. There was no point. The mission was to stop the convoy, and the only way to do that was to keep fighting. If the Salt Lake City fell out of line, the Japanese would close in and destroy her. The only option was to maintain speed, maintain fire, and hope the pumps could keep ahead of the flooding. At 10:15, the Nachi scored another hit on the Salt Lake City, this time striking the after turret. The shell punched through the turret's roof, exploded inside, and killed or wounded half the gun crew. Fire erupted, filling the turret with smoke and flames. The surviving crew members grabbed extinguishers, beat down the flames, loaded another shell, and kept firing. The turret's electric traverse mechanism was destroyed, so they cranked it manually, sweating in the acrid smoke. Their ears ringing from the concussions. The battle had become a test of endurance, not just mechanical endurance, but human. The crews on both sides had been at battle stations for more than 2 hours, breathing smoke, handling heavy shells, operating machinery in temperatures just above freezing. Fatigue dulled reactions. Mistakes accumulated. But the guns kept firing. The Japanese sailors aboard the Nachi and Maya had expected that this battle would be short. They had been told that American cruisers were vulnerable, that American gunnery was inferior, that American morale would crack under sustained bombardment. They had been assured that their spiritual training, the rigorous discipline, instilled through years of service in the Imperial Navy, would give them an advantage in close combat. What they discovered instead was that the Americans did not crack. The Salt Lake City absorbed hit after hit, continued firing, maintained station. The destroyers darted in and out of smoke screens, threatening torpedo attacks that never came, but forced the Japanese to maneuver defensively. And the gunnery, the American gunnery, was precise, methodical, deadly. Every few minutes, shells from the Salt Lake City would straddle the Nachi, Close enough that the officers on the bridge could feel the concussions, Admiral Hosogaya watched from the Nachi's bridge as the battle dragged on. His ammunition was running low. His ships had been maneuvering at high speed for hours, burning fuel at an unsustainable rate. And the Americans impossibly were still fighting. Every time he thought the Salt Lake City was finished, she would emerge from a smokescreen, guns blazing, defiant. At 1100, Hosogaya made a decision. He would break off the engagement. The convoy had already turned back to Paramushiro. There was no point in continuing the fight. His mission was to deliver supplies, not to sink American cruisers. And the longer this battle continued, the greater the risk that American reinforcements, aircraft from Dutch harbor, submarines from patrol stations, would arrive. But breaking off was not simple. The Japanese ships were spread across several miles of ocean, some pursuing the American destroyers, some engaging the cruisers. Coordinating a withdrawal while under fire, in poor visibility, with radio communications jammed by static, required time. And time was something Hosogaya did not have. At 1103, disaster struck the Salt Lake City. A boiler exploded, not from enemy fire, but from stress. Metal pushed beyond its limits, joints failing, pipes rupturing. The engine room flooded with steam and seawater. Power failed. The ship slowed to 10 knots, then 5, then stopped dead in the water, listing 15 degrees to port. Her guns silent, her engines dead. Captain Rogers looked at his engineering officer. The man's face was soot-stained, his eyes red from smoke. "How long?" Rogers asked. 20 minutes if we can isolate the damage. Maybe less if the pumps hold. 20 minutes. The Japanese cruisers were 15,000 yards away and closing. In 20 minutes, they would be within point-blank range. The Salt Lake City would be destroyed. On the bridge of the Richmond, Admiral McMorris received the report from the Salt Lake City, dead in the water, unable to maneuver. He looked at his staff officers. They looked back, waiting for orders. McMorris had 2 options. He could order a retreat, abandon the Salt Lake City, and save the rest of his force. Or he could order the destroyers to counterattack, to charge the Japanese cruisers and buy time for the Salt Lake City to restart her engines. The first option was rational. The second was suicide. McMorris chose suicide. He ordered the destroyers, Bailey, Coghlandale, and Monaghan, to make a torpedo run on the Japanese cruisers. 4 destroyers against 2 heavy cruisers and their escorts. It was a sacrifice play, and everyone knew it. But it was the only way to save the Salt Lake City. The destroyer captains acknowledged the order without hesitation. They formed up in line ahead, increased speed to 30 knots, and turned toward the Japanese fleet. In their wakes, they laid smoke screens to obscure the Salt Lake City. On their bows, torpedo tubes swung out, ready to fire. They did not expect to survive. They expected to die buying time. On the bridge of the Nachi, Admiral Hosogaya watched as the American destroyers emerged from the smoke and charged directly at his cruisers. It was a classic destroyer attack, aggressive, desperate, the kind of move that doctrine said should be countered by turning away, opening the range, and using superior firepower to destroy the attackers before they could launch torpedoes. Hosogaya gave the order to turn away. The Nachi and Maya swung to port, increasing speed, putting distance between themselves and the charging destroyers. The destroyer attack had forced him to maneuver defensively, and in doing so, he had given the Salt Lake City time. At 11:12, the Salt Lake City's engines restarted. Black smoke poured from her stacks as the boilers came back online. The ship shuddered, began moving, slowly at first, then faster. By 11:15, she was making 15 knots. By 11:20, she was making 25. She was damaged, listing, but she was alive. The destroyers turned back, having closed to within 10,000 yards of the Japanese cruisers without launching torpedoes. They had not needed to. The threat alone had been enough. Admiral Hosogaya, watching the American ships reform their line, made his final decision. He ordered a general withdrawal. The Japanese fleet turned northwest and steamed away, leaving the Americans in control of the battlefield. At 12:03, the Battle of the Komandorski Islands ended, not with a climactic explosion or a dramatic sinking, but with two exhausted fleets limping away from each other, too damaged and too low on fuel to continue fighting. The butcher's bill was surprisingly light. The Salt Lake City had taken 5 hits, suffered 7 dead and 20 wounded, and was listing badly, but she could still steam. The Bailey had been hit twice, with minor damage. The Japanese had suffered no direct hits on their major combatants, though several destroyers had been damaged by near misses. But the strategic outcome was decisive. The Japanese convoy had turned back. The supplies destined for Attu did not arrive. The garrison remained isolated, undersupplied, and increasingly desperate. 2 months later, American forces would invade Attu, and the Japanese defenders, starved and outnumbered, would fight to the last man. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands had set the stage for that final tragedy. More importantly, the battle had psychological consequences. Admiral Hosogaya, who had broken off the engagement despite having overwhelming firepower, was relieved of command upon returning to Paramushiro. His superiors viewed his withdrawal as a failure of nerve, an example of the cautious mentality that was losing Japan the war. Hosogaya argued that he had made the correct decision, that preserving his ships was more important than sinking a single American cruiser. But in a military culture that valued aggression over caution, his arguments fell on deaf ears. He was quietly retired, his career over. For the Americans, the battle was a validation. A small task force, outnumbered and outgunned, had fought a superior enemy to a standstill. They had done so not through luck, but through gunnery, tactics, and the willingness to take risks. Admiral McMorris received the Navy Cross. The crew of the Salt Lake City received commendations. And the lesson that aggressive, well-coordinated action could overcome numerical disadvantage became part of U.S. Navy doctrine. But there was another lesson, one that neither side fully understood at the time. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands was the last pure surface gun duel in naval history. Every major naval battle after March 26, 1943, would involve aircraft or submarines or both. The age of the battleship, the era when war was decided by rifled barrels and armored hulls, was over. This was not because guns had become ineffective. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands proved that surface gunnery, properly executed, was still deadly. But it also proved that gun battles were inefficient. 4 hours of firing had resulted in minimal damage on both sides. Hundreds of shells had been expended for a handful of hits. And the outcome had been decided not by who fired more accurately, but by who was willing to risk more. Aircraft changed this calculus. A dive bomber could deliver a 1,000-pound bomb with far greater accuracy than a cruiser could deliver an 8-inch shell. A torpedo bomber could sink a battleship in minutes, and aircraft carriers, operating hundreds of miles from the enemy, could project power without risking their own hulls to enemy fire. The future of naval warfare belonged to air power, not gun power. The men who fought at the Komandorski Islands did not know they were participating in the end of an era. They knew only that they had fought and survived, that they had done their duty, that the mission had succeeded. But history would remember them as the last generation of sailors to fight a battle the way Nelson or Farragut would have recognized. Ships in line, guns firing broadsides, victory determined by seamanship and courage. It was a form of warfare that dated back centuries, and it ended on a cold March morning in the Bering Sea, with 2 fleets limping away from each other, too exhausted to continue. There is a sound that dominated the Battle of the Komandorski Islands, a sound that became, in the memories of the men who were there, the defining sensory experience of the engagement. It was not the roar of guns, though the 8-inch rifles fired hundreds of times. It was not the explosion of shells, though those were terrifying. It was the sound of splashes, the cascading roar of near misses, shells landing 50 yards away, 100 yards away, close enough to drench the deck with seawater, close enough to shake the hull, but not close enough to kill, For 4 hours that sound was constant. Splashes on the port side, splashes on the starboard side, splashes ahead and astern. The Japanese gunners were good. They could bracket a target, putting shells on either side, walking their fire closer with each salvo. But the final step, the transition from near miss to direct hit, was maddeningly difficult. A ship moving at 25 knots covers 12 yards per second. A shell takes 30 seconds to travel 20,000 yards. In that time, the target can move 300 yards. Hitting it requires predicting not just where it is, but where it will be, accounting for wind, wave motion, the rolling of both ships, the temperature of the gun barrels, the age of the powder charges. The splash became a symbol of the difficulty of naval gunnery, of the margin between life and death, of the fact that in war, survival often depends on inches. A shell that lands 5 feet to the left is harmless. A shell that lands 5 feet to the right kills everyone on deck. The difference is mathematics, trajectory, luck. The crews of the Salt Lake City and the Richmond heard those splashes for 4 hours. They learned to distinguish between near and far, between dangerous and merely frightening. They learned to keep working while tons of water cascaded over the deck, soaking them, freezing them, reminding them that the next splash might not be a splash at all. After the battle, when the ships returned to Dutch Harbor, the crews were interviewed by intelligence officers who wanted to understand what had happened, what had worked, what had failed. Many of the sailors, when asked what they remembered most, mentioned the splashes. One gunner's mate, whose battle station was in the forward turret, said, "You hear it hit the water, and you count seconds, waiting for the next one. And you realize you're counting because it gives you something to do, some way to feel like you have control. But you don't. It's just math and luck. And there's nothing you can do except keep loading shells and hope your math is better than theirs." It was an honest assessment, and it captured something essential about the nature of the battle, that it was, fundamentally, a contest of calculations. Who could predict trajectories more accurately? Who could correct fire more quickly? Who could maintain concentration under stress for longer? The side with better math would win. The Japanese sailors aboard the Nachi and Maya experienced the same splashes, the same near misses, the same grinding tension. But for them, the battle had a different meaning. They had been trained to believe that Japanese naval gunnery was superior, that spiritual discipline and relentless practice would give them an edge in combat. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands challenged that belief. The Americans, they discovered, were just as skilled, just as disciplined, just as determined. The idea that cultural superiority translated into tactical advantage was revealed as myth. The Americans did not fight with samurai spirit. They fought with slide rules and stopwatches and the systematic application of gunnery doctrine developed over decades. And it worked. For many Japanese officers, this was a disturbing realization. If American sailors could match Japanese sailors in skill and determination, then the war would be decided by resources, by who had more ships, more shells, more fuel, more men. And that was a contest Japan could not win. Admiral Hosogaya understood this. His decision to withdraw was based not on cowardice, but on calculation. He could have continued the battle, could have pressed the attack, could have sunk the Salt Lake City. But at what cost? How many shells would he expend? How much fuel would he burn? And what if American reinforcements arrived? Aircraft from Dutch Harbor, submarines from patrol zones. The risk was too great. The potential gain was too small. It was a rational decision, but in a military culture that valued aggression over caution, rationality was seen as weakness. Hosogaya's relief from command sent a message to every Japanese officer. Caution would not be rewarded. Victory, no matter the cost, was the only acceptable outcome. This mindset would lead to disaster in the battles to come. At the Philippine Sea, Japanese carriers would launch attacks despite overwhelming American air superiority, losing hundreds of aircraft in the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. At Leyte Gulf, Japanese battleships would sail into a trap, seeking a glorious surface engagement that ended in annihilation. The lesson of the Komandorski Islands, that preservation of force matters more than glory, was ignored. In the years after the war, historians would analyze the Battle of the Komandorski Islands in meticulous detail. They would study the gunnery logs, the track charts, the damage reports. They would note that the Americans fired 271 8-inch shells and scored approximately 3 hits. The Japanese fired over 800 8-inch shells and scored approximately 5 hits. The hit rate for both sides was less than 1%. These statistics led some historians to conclude that the battle was indecisive, that neither side had achieved a clear tactical victory. But this analysis misses the strategic context. The American mission was to stop the Japanese convoy. The convoy turned back. The mission succeeded. The tactical details, how many shells were fired, how many hits were scored, were secondary to the strategic outcome. This is a lesson that applies to all of warfare. Tactics serve strategy. Winning a battle is meaningless if it does not advance strategic objectives. The Japanese won the Battle of the Komandorski Islands in the sense that they inflicted more damage than they received. But they lost strategically because they failed to deliver supplies to Attu, and that failure had cascading consequences. The American understanding of this principle, that strategic objectives matter more than tactical victories, was one of the key advantages they held throughout the Pacific War. The Japanese, trained in a culture that emphasized honor and glory, sometimes pursued tactical victories at the expense of strategic sense. The Americans, pragmatic and methodical, kept their eyes on the larger objectives. The Salt Lake City limped back to Dutch Harbor on March 27th, trailing oil, listing to port, her crew exhausted but alive. Repair crews swarmed over her, patching holes, replacing damaged equipment, preparing her for the next mission. She would fight again, at the Gilbert Islands, at the Marshall Islands, at the Marianas. She would survive the war, one of the few treaty cruisers to do so, and would be decommissioned in 1947, scrapped in 1948. But on March 27, 1943, as she entered Dutch Harbor, her crew stood on deck and watched the shore approach. They did not cheer. They did not celebrate. They simply watched, silent, processing what they had experienced. Some would later say that the Battle of the Komandorski Islands was the longest 4 hours of their lives. Others would say it felt like minutes, that the intensity of combat compressed time, made hours feel like seconds. One sailor, writing to his family weeks later, tried to explain what it was like. "We were outgunned and outnumbered," he wrote. "Everyone knew it. But we fought anyway. Not because we were brave, but because that's what we were supposed to do. And somehow it worked. I don't know if it was skill or luck or God or what. But we're alive, and the mission succeeded, and I guess that's all that matters." It was a modest assessment, but it captured the essence of American naval doctrine in World War II. Do your job, trust your training, and trust that the system, the logistics, the intelligence, the industrial capacity will support you. The story of the Battle of the Komandorski Islands is not well known. It lacks the drama of Midway, the scale of Leyte Gulf, the tragedy of Pearl Harbor. It was a minor engagement in a secondary theater, involving a handful of ships fighting for control of insignificant islands in a frozen sea. But it deserves to be remembered because it represents something that was disappearing from warfare. The idea that battles could be fought between equals, that courage and skill could overcome numerical disadvantage, that the human element mattered as much as technology. After the Komandorski Islands, naval warfare became increasingly mechanized, increasingly dependent on technology. Aircraft carriers replaced battleships as the capital ships of navies. Radar and sonar replaced lookouts and intuition. Missiles replaced guns. The age of the surface gun duel ended, and with it, a certain romance. The idea that war could be a test of skill, a duel between warriors, rather than a contest of industrial production. The men who fought at the Komandorski Islands were the last to experience that older form of warfare. They did not realize it at the time. They were too busy fighting, too focused on survival, to consider the historical significance of what they were doing. But history remembers them as it remembers all last things. The last cavalry charge, the last dreadnought battle, the last moments of an era fading into the past. There is a monument at Dutch Harbor, Alaska, erected in 1993 on the 50th anniversary of the battle. It consists of a bronze plaque mounted on a stone base overlooking the harbor where the Salt Lake City and Richmond returned after the engagement. The plaque lists the names of the ships that fought, the names of the men who died, and a brief description of the battle. Few people visit it. Dutch Harbor is remote, accessible only by air or sea, frequented mostly by fishermen and Coast Guard personnel. The tourists who do come are usually there for the scenery, not the history. The monument stands alone, overlooking grey water that looks much the same as it did on March 26, 1943. But on quiet days, when the wind is calm and the fog lifts, it is possible to stand at that monument and imagine what it was like. To imagine the sound of 8-inch guns firing in sequence, the roar of shells overhead, the crash of splashes close alongside. To imagine young men, some barely out of high school, standing at their battle stations, loading shells, calculating ranges, doing their jobs while tons of high explosive rain down around them. To imagine the tension, the fear, the determination to keep fighting no matter what, and to understand that what they were fighting for was not glory or honor or even victory in the traditional sense. They were fighting because that was their duty, because their country had asked them to, because the alternative, abandoning the mission, letting the enemy win, was unacceptable. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands ended at 1203 hours on March 26, 1943. The guns fell silent. The ships turned away from each other. The smoke drifted apart. The sea, which had been churned into foam by shells and wakes, settled back into its long, heavy swells. In the weeks that followed, both sides would claim victory. The Japanese would point to the damage inflicted on the Salt Lake City, the American retreat under smoke screens, the fact that their fleet remained intact. The Americans would point to the fact that the convoy had turned back, that the mission had succeeded, that they had fought a superior force to a standstill. Both were correct, and both were missing the point. The real outcome of the Battle of the Komandorski Islands was not measured in ships sunk or damage inflicted. It was measured in what it represented, the end of an era, the transition from one form of warfare to another, the moment when guns gave way to aircraft, when human skill became less important than technological superiority, when war became a contest not of warriors, but of systems. The men who fought at the Komandorski Islands did not know they were witnessing this transition. They knew only that they had fought and survived, that they had done their duty, that the splashes had fallen close, but not close enough. They knew the sound of near misses, the sound of survival, the sound of an older world fading into the past, and in the end, that sound, the roar of splashes, the thunder of guns, the steady rhythm of a surface gun duel fought at extreme range in freezing seas, is what history remembers, not a climactic victory, not a dramatic defeat, just the last time that navies fought the way they had fought for centuries, before the world changed and left them behind. The grey water remembers nothing. The cold wind forgets everything, but the sound remains, echoing across the decades. A reminder that some endings come not with explosions, but with silence. The silence of guns that will never fire again, of battles that will never be fought again, of an age that ended on a frozen sea at the edge of the world. March 26, 1943, the last dance of the guns, the final waltz of an era, the sound of history turning one splash at a time.